I guess we'll get started. My name is Joe Lombardo. I am the coordinator of UNAC, United National Anti-War Coalition, which is a coalition in the United States of peace and justice groups. We can be found at our website, which is unacpeace.org. And if your organization is not a member of UNAC, one of the tabs on that website will be Join, and you can have your organization join UNAC there. You could also make sure your name is on our email list. And you could also find us on YouTube. I think YouTube, our name is at UNAC 4073. Not sure why it is that, but that's what it is. And on Twitter, we're at UNAC1. And on Instagram, we're at UNAC Peace. So you could find us at any one of those, on any one of those platforms. And I urge you to go to there, as well as Facebook. You can find us on Facebook. We have 2 Facebook groups and a Facebook page. I'd urge you to like the Facebook page and to join the Facebook group so we can have discussions back and forth. A lot of discussion happens on those Facebook groups. Today we're going to talk about a trip to Russia that Dan Kovalik and Rick Sterling recently took at the end of April until mid-May period. What they saw, what they heard from the people who were there, and have a discussion out of that, I'm sure, of the main world political situation that's going on right now, which is basically a proxy war between the United States and Russia that's taking place in Ukraine. I have also been to Russia a couple of times, not since the special military operation, but I was there once right after the coup for a peace conference. I was there again, I think it was 2018, to speak at a youth conference, and then I went and did a little tour of some universities where I spoke in Russia. If there's questions that come up that I can answer from any of that experience, I'd be happy to do that also during the question and discussion period. As I mentioned, there is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. That's where you should put questions to the speakers, because if you try to do it on the chat, it'll just scroll up and we will miss it. So the format is going to be that the speakers will speak for a period of time. Dan first, Rick second, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. As I'm sure everybody knows, Russia and Russians are vilified very much in the United States. So it is important, if you can, although it's discouraged and it's difficult for people from the West to go to Russia, and Russians are not really allowed into the United States these days, but it's important to have that kind of dialogue, although many people think it's important to have a dialogue and discussions, peace discussions in Ukraine. The United States and its allies are resisting that, but we can have people-to-people discussions. So it is very important to get those discussions, hear what people think, see what Russia is really like. The experience with the vilification of Russia and Russians is not unique. We saw it during the so-called war on terror with Muslims, that they were vilified. We see it with the Chinese, that they are vilified. Whoever the U.S. State Department and the government defines as the enemy, they get vilified, and this leads towards more war. And in the case of Russia, the United States is now confronting a major nuclear power, and it brings danger to the entire world. So we as a peace movement must do what we can to overcome that, one of the ways is to visit and learn the truth about what's going on in Russia and the situation in that area of the world. So our first speaker is Dan Kovalik. He's a human rights and labor rights lawyer. He teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He is the author of a number of articles that have appeared in publications like Counterpunch, Huffington Post, and a number of others. And he is the author of a number of books. And he will be our first speaker, so I'll turn it over to Dan.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really honored to be here with UNAC, and I see there's people tuning in from all over the world, so I appreciate that. So first, let me just tell you a little bit about our journey. Rick and I decided to go to Russia, really to, in many ways engage in what, used to be known during the first Cold War as, people-to-people diplomacy. As Joe was saying, and is pretty obvious, it's not just the Russian government that's being vilified. It's the Russian people, to the extent that, Russian athletes and Russian musicians are being canceled, their performances and ability to compete are being canceled in a way that, by the way, doesn't happen when the U.S. invades a country. Let's be serious about that, right? The U.S. invades Iraq or Libya or Serbia, and there are no repercussions for Americans due to that, and they're not made to have to give disloyalty oaths or whatnot in order to compete. And you have statements by the State Department that Russia is nothing but a gas station posing as a country and whatnot, which are just hateful statements. So I think the big reason we wanted to go was to be able to see what's happening in Russia, how people in Russia feel about the conflict, about their daily lives, and really also just to go as an act of defiance against what is basically a travel ban to Russia from the West. You cannot go directly to Russia anymore. You used to be able to take a flight directly from New York City, for example, to Moscow, no problem. Even during the first Cold War, you could do that, right? You can't do that anymore. You either have to fly a foreign airline through a third country like Turkey to get to Russia, or you do what we did, and that is fly to Helsinki, Finland, and then drive across into St. Petersburg, which is what we did. And again, what's interesting, again, is that even during the First World War, you had train service, right, from Finland famously into Petrograd. It was called Petrograd then, into Finland Station, which of course Lenin famously took that train into Russia in April of 1917 during the height of World War I. But that train is now not running. There is very little traffic now between Finland and Russia because of the sanctions. In any case, so we went to St. Petersburg first, and people were already getting ready. We went in late April. People were already getting ready for May 9th, which is Victory Day celebrations, Victory Day over the Nazis, which is a huge celebration in Russia. I think it's very hard to understand Russia and their feelings about what's happening right now and what has been happening really since the collapse of the Soviet Union without understanding their role in World War II and the amount that they suffered during World War II, which I think is being largely denied now by the West. I think there's a huge attempt by the West to deny even the Soviet Union's contribution to that war. And I think a lot of younger people in the West are quite unaware of it, though in Russia, people are painfully aware of it. On May 9th, for example, in St. Petersburg, people walking on the streets with photos of relatives who died during World War II, either from the Nazis who, laid siege to St. Petersburg, then known as Leningrad, in which I believe about 600,000 people died during that 700+ day siege. People were carrying carnations that they laid at various war memorials. I've never seen any, kind of analogous commemoration in the United States, unless you count watching fireworks as on 4th of July is analogous, which I don't think it is. And, the reception we got was pretty incredible. I mean, I think what I've always been struck by in most countries I visit is that people are able to distinguish between the US government and the American people. People love Americans, generally speaking. And in Russia, that's not an exception. When people heard us speaking English and figured out we were from the US, people were very friendly, wanted to help us. And we talked to a lot of people, random people. We tried to talk to random people about the war and how they felt about the war. And while obviously people, are not unanimous about their feelings about it, I would say that, the overwhelming sentiment is one that, they're not happy about it. They are worried about it. They're worried about the loss of lives on both sides. They don't hate the Ukrainians. They see the Ukrainians as their brothers and sisters. They're afraid that this is going to go on for a long time. And they're afraid, frankly, that this could end up in a nuclear war. In a way, again, that I don't think Americans are really cognizant of or concerned enough about. I think the Russians are very concerned about that. At the same time, I think a lot of Russians also believe that the conflict beginning in February of 2022 was necessary for not only for Russia, but for the people, particularly in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And I actually was able to visit the Donbass in November. I visited the Donetsk People's Republic. I'd like to talk a little bit about that because I think that's very relevant to all these discussions. In Donetsk, again, I was there in November. So this was 3 months after there were those referenda in the 4 different regions to join Russia. And so this was 3 months after that. And so it was interesting to see how people, again, in the Donetsk People's Republic felt about that. And again, I would say people were uniformly supportive of joining Russia, felt that, again, some relief that Russia had intervened because there had been a war being waged against them by the government in Kiev since 2014. That had been covered a bit by the mainstream press, just a bit, not a lot, but it had been covered a bit here and there. Since 2014, but then once Russia, intervened in February of last year, the press has tried to make us forget that ever happened. And people who speak about it speak about the 14,000 people who died in that conflict, even before Russia intervened last year. Those people are being silenced, and they're claimed to be somehow conspiracy theorists. And also, I'll tell you, there was a lot of construction and reconstruction being done in Donetsk by the Russians. Hospitals being built, housing. And again, people were happy about that. People felt safer because the Russians were there, even though shelling from Ukraine continued while I was there. A school was shelled. A place where people gather water was shelled because, of course, Ukraine cut Donetsk off from the water supply. A stadium, they attempted to shell a stadium as well. And that shelling's continued even now to this day. Again, that's not being covered much in the news. And the interesting thing that people said in Donetsk, Donetsk up till 1961 was known as Stalino. Okay. And then when de-Stalinization happened, it went back to being Donetsk. And there's a saying that people had there, first Stalingrad, now Stalino. Stalingrad was the big situs of the big battle, which was critical, seen as really the turning point in the war, where now the Germans were in retreat for the first time, I believe, beginning in 1943. They saw themselves as the ones to now defeat fascism, again, because their view was that they are fighting fascism and neo-Nazis that have attacked the Donbass. And so I think that's an important view. I'll just say, give you one fact about that. According to the Organization for European Security and Cooperation, which is a 57-member body, which many Western countries are on, including the United States, they concluded that there was over 2,000 ceasefire violations between the government of Kiev and the Donbass in the weekend before Russia intervened in February of 2022. And that was like a 30 times increase from before. And this is what the Russians were seeing, when they intervened against something I think that's important to think about. We also went to Moscow. We were there for a few days, and then before deciding to go to take the 27-hour train ride to Crimea, I'll let Rick talk about the Crimea in particular, which I think is really the heart of our trip. We decided, honestly, that was our plan B. We wanted to go back. I wanted to go back to the Donbass. Rick wanted to go to the Donbass. That kind of fell through. And we decided on our own to go to Crimea. And I should say that, we planned our own trip. We paid for our own trip. No one had anything to do with our trip. We did it on our own, traveled on our own, and who we saw and who we spoke to was up to us. I just want to make that clear in case people have questions about that. Let me, if I may, I'd like to just show some photos from the trip. I think people like photos, and then I'll turn it over to Rick. And of course, then we'll have a question and answer period, which I think is important, so you can focus in on what you're interested in. But let me show you a few photos here. If I can do this. Did that work? Okay, 1 second.
We don't see anything, Dan.
Okay, 1 second. 1 second. Let me see if I can. Yeah, it just kind of went black on me here. 1 second. How about there? Are you seeing them now?
No, we're not seeing them.
Okay.
We had it working before, so.
Yeah, let me try one more time. Let me try one more time, everybody.
Is he doing the screen share?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Yeah, just give me 1 second.
Once you get it up, you got to do screen share. Share screen.
Okay, I think it's going to work. Just give it 1 second to load here. Hey, Rick, can I tell your money belt story while we're waiting for the photos to load?
Yeah, go ahead. The most famous money belt around
in the world.
Go ahead, Dan.
So yeah, when we were on the train to Crimea, Rick realized he had left his money belt with quite a bit of money back in the hotel in Moscow, which could have been.
You're frozen, Dan. Dan, I don't know what's going on, but
Yeah.
I think what we need to do is go over to Rick, have him do his presentation.
Yeah.
And you get it settled, Dan, we could get you back on with your pictures and for the questions and discussion. So we're going to turn it over to Rick Sterling.
Yeah.
I'm going to introduce him. He's a peace and justice activist from out in California these days, I think originally from Canada. He's a member of the Syria Solidarity Movement, the Sanctions Kill Campaign, where he produced and was one of the writers with a number of others, a book on sanctions called The Impact and Consequences of U.S. Sanctions, which include the sanctions on Russia, which have been perhaps the stiffest ever on any country. He is the author of many articles. He's also a member of the Task Force in the Americas and the Mount Diablo, California Peace and Justice Center. So here's Rick.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here today. I've got a little PowerPoint that I'll share. So is that okay? Can you view that, Joe? Joe?
Yes, we can see it, Dan. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. Don't mute. Don't mute. Okay, yeah. Well, what we saw and heard in Crimea, which is very much a flashpoint in the NATO-Russia conflict. Oh no. Okay, essentials of Crimea history, just a background for those who are not familiar. Crimea has been part of Russia since Catherine the Great took on the Ottoman Empire in 1783. In 1954, when they were all part of the Soviet Union, the Premier Khrushchev said that the Crimea should be administered under Ukraine. In 1991, with the breakup of the USSR, Crimeans held a referendum right then and there and said that they wanted to secede from Ukraine and be their own autonomous republic. That was not well received in Kiev. They had negotiations and they ended up staying in the Ukraine, but as an autonomous republic. So it was the Autonomous Republic of Crimea within Ukraine, and that was just for a short 20 odd years, whereas for 200 years had been part of Russia. In 2014, there was the coup in Kiev in February, and then very quickly there was the referendum and what they call the reunification. One of our goals was to learn a lot more details about what exactly happened in the wake of the coup and how they proceeded to hold the referendum, and we got a lot more details on that. That was very important. It's very important to be aware of how divided Ukraine was. In this map from the 2010 presidential elections, which were observed by the OSCE and other international observers, the map shows it very clearly. The red and the dark red were voting for Yanukovych, and in the 75%, the dark red were voting 75+% for Yanukovych, and Western Ukraine was not. So, the map shows how divided politically Ukraine was. It translates also into the ethnicity. There's numerous ethnicities in Ukraine, of course. Predominantly, the Western Ukraine are people of Ukrainian, speak Ukrainian as their first language, and in the East, their native language is Russian, and they consider themselves Russian. Crimea, of course, was just kind of appointed without consultation to being part of Ukraine when they were all part of the Soviet Union. What triggered Crimea to reunify with Russia? It was partly the demographics I was just speaking of, the adverse reaction to the Ukrainian ultra-nationalism, and to some extent a Russophobia that people were seeing in many ways. The Maidan massacre in February. There were 3 Crimean who were police officers who were killed, and their bodies were brought back to Crimea. That triggered a lot of worry and concern. There were 8 buses loads of Crimeans who had gone to Kiev to peacefully protest against the violence and the chaos taking place in the city. And on February 20, after the massacre in the Maidan Plaza, they realized that peaceful protest was hopeless, and they headed back, and their buses were attacked in Korsun. There were hundreds who were brutalized. There were 7 who were killed. 1 bus was set on fire, and the attack was carried out by the so-called right sector. This was another trigger. And then, of course, the first day after the coup government took place, they moved to remove Russian as a national language of the country, and that was a big factor in the decision. On February 20, there was the massacre. The coup government took place 2 days later. The massacre was really the spark that set in motion, and this was a massacre of both police and protesters. Professor Ivan Ketchenovsky of University of Ottawa has done detailed examination for years and years, and proven conclusively that the snipers who were doing the killing, and there were multiple snipers, they were in opposition-controlled buildings, and so they were the ones, and they wanted to spark the coup, and they did. Very soon after, on March 16, the Crimea held a referendum and voted with 83% turnout. 97% said they wanted to secede from Ukraine and reunify with Russia. This prompted sanctions from the West. They really began at this point. The heavy anti-Russia, the sanctions on Russia began not last year, but they began in 2014, following Crimea's accession to Russia. One of the purposes we had in going to Crimea was to get more details, and I found this very interesting book, To Go One's Own Way. There's an English version of it. We're trying to get it published and online, because the list of documents shows that the Autonomous Republic of Crimea from November 2013 was speaking out very strongly against the chaos and the violence happening in Kiev. They were expressing their worry about the unification or the unity of the country, and they were denouncing the Russophobia taking place. And then the documents show the resolutions and the statements from the legislature of Crimea, which is located in the capital, Simferopol. They clearly show how the process of them criticizing what was going on, speaking out, expressing their worry, expressing their fear, and then after the coup took place, expressing their decision to hold a referendum, and then following the referendum, the plea they made to Moscow to accept the request from Crimea to accede to that country, to the Russian Federation, and then the decision. So these are a lot of important documents, and sadly, they're not available online anywhere right now. So we're working to make that happen, because these show in writing what the Crimean government was doing from early on, from months before the coup took place. People wonder, well, what's happened after Crimea joined Russia? People there told us, and I was in Crimea in 2016 as well as just a few weeks ago, and one of the reasons that I wanted to go back was to see how things had changed and see if attitudes had changed and so forth. But what we learned is that under Ukrainian administration, there was no investment in the country. The infrastructure was falling apart. There's a famous a children's camp called Artek that that provided instruction and fun and games and year-round training for youth, for tens of thousands of youth. It was falling apart. And then when I was there in 2016, we could see it was being built up. It was already accepting youth. Thousands of youth were there having a great time, and we could see that was state-of-the-art swimming pool and other facilities. But the infrastructure development, the bridge to the over the Kerch Strait to Krasnodar and the Russian mainland, that was built and finished a few years ago. So there was a huge difference in the development. One thing is that might surprise people is there are playgrounds all over the place in Crimea. So it's not just a question of infrastructure. And there's definitely a lot of attention paid to activities and games for children, both music and art, and as well as just, well, things like skateboarding here. In the port city of Sevastopol, it was really interesting to visit the Partisan Museum. This is located in a house in the city, and it's a fairly big house. But within it, the resistance organized to the Nazi occupation, because Crimea was under Nazi occupation for a year and a half, 1942 to March of 1944. It was under Nazi occupation. So at this house, they were planning activities. They had a print shop in a hidden basement. They had weapons buried in the backyard. They had organized sabotage campaigns and so forth. So this was another, seeing the Partisan Museum just brought home to us that fascism and occupation, these are not just words to the Crimeans or the Russian people generally. They're very conscious of war and Nazism because of the experience. Now, of course, the people now, it's their older generation that experienced this firsthand, but it carries on. There's a lot of education that goes on around it. This is a photo. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's a photo of a Nazi massacre and villagers who are looking at the corpses and trying to find their loved ones. Here's a photo of some of the partisans. And this is the hidden door, which goes down to the print shop. They remember fascism, occupation, and war. Outside of Sevastopol, there's a hill, and on the hill was the headquarters of the Nazi military, and that is now a museum of liberation. So it was liberated on March 7, 1944, and there's all sorts of relics from World War II there. But I think the important thing is that they really do remember the war. It's an important part of the education process for children to learn their history. and their understanding of neo-Nazism and ultranationalism and Russophobia in Ukraine is a big part of the backstory there as well. Here's a photo from this. This was a Saturday, so there were lots of people walking around the area. And here's a tyke who is proudly, he's got his Russian military uniform on and the St. George's ribbon, which is worn traditionally around May 9 Victory Day. Now, on the streets of the Crimean capital, it was really interesting. We saw two different incidents where a group of teenagers was singing songs. In this case, the boy to Dan's right was filming the girls or video recording the girls singing patriotic songs. And you can see they've got their St. George's ribbons on, but it's really hard to imagine that taking place here, but it just it's a different consciousness than we have because of 27 million dead in Russia. Everybody's grandfather or great grandparents or in some cases parents suffered or died in the war, so they remember it, and they're full of good spirit. It's not done in a negative way of promoting hate. Just the opposite. It's really it's kind of respecting the fact that we need peace, we need friendship, we need to overcome differences, and I think that's the spirit of it. We visited a really interesting place. This is the entrance to the Balaclava nuclear sub-base. This was a submarine, a nuclear armed submarine base that is under a mountain in the port town of Balaclava. Now it's a museum, but in World War II and up until the mid-50s, it was an active base, and they would retool and refit the submarines that came into this area, and it basically goes for about half a mile under the mountain from the open Black Sea into the port of Balaclava. And right now there's all sorts of school children that tour this place, that learn about the history, here's the education part of the museum, and here's a young man who's looking at this. There was one large school group that was passing through there while we were there as well. We did take note that they start off talking about how the U.S. is the only country to use nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the implication is this is what the Soviet Union had to worry about, and we can be sure that that Russia has nuclear submarines today. They're just in different locations. This has been converted into a first-class museum. But it shows the commitment and the willingness to pour resources into having a defensive capability or a strike back capability that exists today. And I think the last article that Dan and I wrote it's subtitled "The Hate Goes One Way," and this is what we felt in Crimea. We saw statues like this that honor a Ukrainian poet. Ukrainian is an official language of Crimea, as is Tatar, the indigenous population of Crimea. So you've got the three languages, Russian, Ukrainian, and Tatar. there were flowers placed at the foot of this statue of a famous Ukrainian poet. And it's just an example that we didn't get any sense of the Crimeans having hostility to Ukrainians. There are brothers and sisters, and what they fear is war. And they all are very, very aware that this is not a war against Ukraine. This is a war with the U.S., which this is the U.S. proxy war, which has sadly turned Ukraine into a tool to attack Russia. The future of Crimea. Here's something that was written in November of 2021. So just a few months before Russia intervened, you had the U.S. signing a charter partnership with Washington signed it with Kiev, with the Zelensky government, and with the U.S. stating that U.S. does not and will never recognize Russia's attempted annexation of Crimea. This was just one more provocation that in a long train of provocations. And then, of course, in the following month of December 2021, Russia proposed agreements with both NATO and with the United States, which said everybody's security needs to be considered and protected. And we consider NATO, Ukraine joining NATO to be a threat to our security, but the US and NATO, as we know, just blew them off. In February of 2023, Zelensky was saying we will take back Crimea, and they've been doing that. They've been saying things comparable since. When we were on the train approaching the Kerch Strait Bridge from mainland Russia to Crimea, there was a sabotage of a fuel depot that had happened just a short time before, and so we could see the smoke rising from our passing train. There's a little closer view. So this just underscores the fact that Kiev and Washington just refuse to accept the reality that the will of the Crimean people, with all of the historical backdrop, was to rejoin Russia. Washington just will not accept that, no matter the reality. The right of self-determination, if we think of Quebec, Canada, my homeland, Quebec held a vote, and they ended up deciding not to break away from Canada, but nobody complained about that, or the basis of it at least. And of course, Scotland has done the same thing. And the U.S. has actually promoted the breakup of the Yugoslavia, the secession of Kosovo from Serbia, South Sudan from Sudan, and there's numerous examples. So the hypocrisy is great. On the trip, we were actually based in Yalta. I just got a few more slides here. There is in Yalta, which is a beautiful tourist port city. There's the Yalta Palace, and this is where the so-called Big Three had their negotiations at the end of World War II. And one of the striking things about that is that, and this is the actual conference table where the negotiations were held. And I think we need to contrast that with the lack of negotiation going on today. Of course, the Soviet Union played the major role in defeating the Nazi Germany, and the Yalta Conference was a discussion of spheres of influence, but it's symptomatic of the U.S. position today that they aren't willing to discuss. They aren't willing to negotiate, and they aren't willing to consider that Russia could have some concerns about Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. And where are we headed? And this is the big question, because it looks to me like if we don't put a stop to where things are going, there is a real danger of either an accidental or intentional first nuclear strike. If that does happen, if it's intentional, I believe it will be by the United States. It just points to the urgency of stopping and demanding negotiation, of encouraging our fellow U.S. citizens to speak out against the war, which is helping no one. It's causing huge destruction to Ukraine, and it's causing a lot of hurt, damage to Russia as well. But I guess that's the point from the U.S. perspective. But I think we need to stop it. We need to reverse course ASAP. So let's see. So, Dan, did you want to show your photos from Russia now?
When I tried to load it.
I hear
Can you
you,
hear
Dan.
me?
Go on. Yes.
Okay, when I tried to load it, somehow I was, I disconnected. But I wouldn't mind adding just a couple things if I could on Crimea before we go to Q&A, or.
Okay, if you could do that, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah. So I just want to say a couple things. The thing that has struck me in terms of Crimea is that the Ukraine is hardly done. It has hardly worked to win the hearts and minds of the Crimean people. Right after they had this referendum in which 94% of the people there voted to go with Russia. Ukraine ended up cutting off electricity to Crimea. People were without electricity for 8 months. They also cut off water. They dammed a river that fed Crimea with fresh water. The reservoir went dry. After the special military operations began in February of last year, Russia bombed that dam so the water would flow again. And now the reservoir, as we witnessed, is full. And as Rick pointed out, we witnessed, this one bombing of a oil installation. We were there when we were in Crimea, but when we were in Crimea, there were a number of drone attacks on Crimea, and not on the Russians, but on civilian infrastructure of Crimea. As I said, Ukraine knows that the Crimeans don't want to go back to Ukraine. The U.S. knows it too, but they don't care, and I think that's an important point. The other thing that people are concerned about is not just the idea of Crimea going back to Ukraine, but they believe that NATO wants to use the Black Sea port there for themselves, right? That's really the ultimate goal of NATO. So they see the interventionist goals by NATO in Crimea as well, which also, led them to want to join Russia. So I just wanted to point out those couple facts. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. We'll do some questions and answers and see what we can talk about. If you have questions and answers, please put them in the question and answer icon down on the bottom of your screen. Click on that and put your questions and answers. There's a few that I've been collecting as people were talking, and let me just do some of the more logistical ones first. There was a question of will we get these slides? And I know we didn't see Dan's slides, but perhaps if they can send them to me, and you can send to unacpeace@gmail.com. Anybody that does that, I will happily send them out to them.
Great, thank you.
That's the best way to do that. There were other kinds of questions about your trip that were more of the logistical nature, like how do people get to Russia and get to Crimea, and what's the visa process like, and is it possible for other people to go? I wonder if either of you would like to answer that question.
I can take a crack at that. Is that okay? Dan, visa, you can get a visa, but you have to go through an agency that can have contact with the Russian embassy in Washington. Of course, Russian consulates around the country have been shut down for several years. So I found that I had to use a service, but you can get a 3-year visa for Russia. It's pricey. It costs about $450, but that's what I did, and I believe Dan did as well. In terms of getting there, we flew to Helsinki. But we're going to next time, and hopefully I'll be going back again, and I think Dan might be going back even sooner. Next time we would fly from the U.S. to Istanbul, Turkey, and then Turkish Air has direct flights to St. Petersburg and Moscow. We flew to Helsinki and then went by land. Within Russia, there's a terrific train system. And anybody can access it, and then you can even reserve your tickets if you like. RussianRailways.com works very well, and you can even we found we could use our Western credit cards. Another point, just in terms of logistics, and if people go there, we encourage people to go there and break the sanctions, break the cancel effort against Russia. Go and see for yourself. They're amazing cities. They're beautiful cities. They're clean. They're safe. The streets are vibrant. People on them. The streets are packed with people day and night. And we found that zenhotels.com, we were able to reserve hotels and even use Western credit card. So that's a couple of tips.
There's also a question about what language you were speaking in. Were people understanding English? How did you communicate with people in the areas? Dan, you're muted.
In Crimea, we actually hired a translator or an interpreter to help us. So we had an interpreter with us for the 5 days we were there. We hired a driver as well. And the interpreter also happens to be the head of the Crimean Tourist Board. So she was a wonderful guide as well. But yeah, so we had excellent translation in Crimea. In the mainland of Russia, it's not hard to find people who speak some level of English, and we would talk to those folks. But to the extent that people didn't speak English or not much, for example, on the train, we would use our phones, translation apps, and they would use theirs, and then we would communicate that way. So, where there's a will, there's a way. And people were very patient with us, very nice. Again, wanted to communicate, wanted to be friendly with us. On the trains, by the way, people shared food with us and drink. It was a very communal, very nice experience. We were on trains for about 70 hours, by the way, which is a long time, and in close quarters with people. And, we had nothing but positive relations with people. We were probably the only 2 Americans on a train with like 1,000 people, which is pretty incredible. So we stood out like a sore thumb. But again, for most people, that was intriguing for them. And so they wanted to communicate, and we found a way to do that. The other thing I should mention, again, in terms of far from being anti-Western, most menus in Russia have English. I went to the opera in St. Petersburg in November, 4-hour opera, and they had English subtitles going across the top of the stage, in addition to Russian ones, in case you couldn't understand what people were singing. So it's not, people still really feel a simpatico with foreigners and with Americans, and are happy that you're there, which needed needs to be pointed out. I even befriended a family that I met in Red Square in November, and they had me to their house this time and gave me a very big, nice meal, and were thrilled to have me, thrilled to talk to me about their feelings about the war and whatnot. So in any case, we did manage pretty well to communicate with people.
My experience in my two trips, one was in 2014, right after the coup, and the other was in 2018, I believe, was there was a big difference in terms of the number of people that spoke English between those 4 years. And on my second trip, I actually went to a couple of universities and spoke to auditoriums of young people. And there was a woman who was with me from Lugansk who spoke. She was going to school in the United States at the time, and she was a friend, and she came to translate. But they said, you don't need a translator in the universities because everybody does speak English in the universities. So I gave my talks in English, and the question and answers were all in English. And I thought that was interesting because if a Russian came to the United States, they would never find the reverse to be true. They could not give a Russian talk in Russian in the United States. Yet languages like Russian and Chinese are going to be major important languages in the future, and it's an important thing. Did you find freedom of press, freedom of expression? Did you find people that seemed reluctant to talk to you? What was your general feelings about the freedom in Russia?
You want to take that, Rick?
Yeah, sure. Well, we had one conversation with a young person. She was actually the waitress in the restaurant we went to the first couple of days in St. Petersburg, and she spoke good English. And so we asked her if she would like to go out for coffee after she was done, after her shift ended. She was a student at St. Petersburg State University. She was in training, but she wanted to come to the U.S. But she was a person who, we asked her, well, she was definitely not on the main track. She was anti-Putin. She was pro-Navalny. She kind of romanticized the West. She was sorry that Starbucks had left, even though she agreed the coffee was not very good, and that there's a Starbucks now just called Stars, and otherwise it's the same. But she missed the vibe of Starbucks, I guess. Anyway, she had no reluctance about expressing her opinion. I was watching the TV, and they didn't have English subtitles. It was just in Russian, so I couldn't tell exactly what was going on. But they were preparing for Victory Day, and that seemed more, I think that was more or less the government line. But I don't know whether there's debates or not. Certainly in the U.S., mainstream media touts the party line as well, or touts the government line. But otherwise, we talked with people, and I didn't sense any reluctance to express their opinion. We did ask, can you organize a demonstration? And they said it has to be registered. And that I don't know. It may be more. I think there probably is more suppression of anti-government protests, and especially anti-war protests there. But Dan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, again, my anecdotal, evidence is that people, at least on the street, felt totally open to tell us what they thought. A number of people told us they don't like Putin, right? Or they give us the thumbs down on Putin. Sometimes I wondered if it was they told us that because that's what they thought we wanted to hear, but whatever. They didn't seem afraid to say that. And again, they'd say it out in the open with other people listening and that sort of thing. and about the war too. People were free if they, to say, oh, they were against the war. They never thought it should have happened. They wanted to end quickly. I mean, certainly that sentiment's pretty common, that they wanted to end as soon as possible. Again, so and honestly, in terms of police presence, and again, Rick, you can correct me on this, but again, my anecdotal evidence is I felt that on average, probably there were less police on the streets than I see at my own streets in Pittsburgh. In Crimea, there was no military, presence. You did see some military vehicles driving around, but, again, there were no troops on the streets. There were cops, but they were Crimean cops directing traffic or whatever. But it didn't feel like a police state. I'll just say that. And if you think about it, again, we bought our own tickets for the train. We got on with our, we had to show our passport to get on the train, show our U.S. passport. They let us on, let us off. There were cops that went on and off the train during various stops. No one bothered us. No one seemed to care that we're Americans walking around and going to Crimea, as it's being, periodically drone attacked. No one seemed to care we were there, which I think is kind of interesting, and frankly, we were warned not to go to Crimea a couple days before we went by some friends who thought that we might have trouble going there, right after Zelensky had said that he plans on retaking Crimea, and right after some drones had hit some oil installations there. They thought the Russians would be on high alert for Americans just walking around talking to people about how they felt about the war. But we didn't have a problem. I'll just say that. Anecdotally, we were in country for about 20 days. Yeah. We traveled freely. We spoke freely to people. And I think that's that's an interesting fact, that a good takeaway,
Yeah, I can just one to add to that. I don't even know what the Russian police uniform looks like, because I don't think I saw any. We did see some military in Sevastopol is a naval port. It's a military base. And we saw a military parade. They were warming up for the Victory Day celebration, but I don't recall ever seeing a regular police. And in that regard, one of the people we talked with in Crimea, who was really in the heart of it during the 2014 process, where there was a popular demand to hold a referendum, and she was laughing how the Western media, some of the Western media showed tanks in Crimea, suggesting they were Russian tanks and that the vote was taking place under duress. And she said there were photos of a World War II tank that's in a park. So the idea that it's a big police presence or a big military, that's couldn't be further from the truth.
There's a question, and I'll add to a little piece of it, of whether or not you've spoken to any Ukrainian leftists. And I would add to the question, have you spoken to any Russian leftists? And what does that mean? And I could put my 2 cents into that too. But I'll let you answer first, and then I'll go.
Can I take that at first, Rick? Yes. I mean, I have some folks that I met in November that I'm still good friends with, that I text with, that I, that are leftists, that are Marxists. And first of all, they have different views about what's going on. There's no uniform view, even amongst leftists, which is true, of course, in our own country. Some are very critical of Putin. Some don't like Putin. Some think the special military operation was necessary. Others don't. They think that, maybe there was a different way to deal with what was happening, though they did think it was a serious situation in the Donbass. But again, they were against the special military operations. Obviously, true leftists and socialists, while they may have some agreement with Putin on some things, Putin would not be their guy, because Putin is a capitalist. Let's face it. And there is a Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which is the second biggest party there. And, it should be noted that they thought Russia should have gone into the Donbass in 2014 to protect people. And they were a big mover in pushing the special military operations. They were the ones that put in a proposal in the Duma to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent nations. And they put that in the Duma, I believe, at the end of 2021, early 2022, and that ended up passing the Duma, and Putin signed that into law. And that's when he formally recognized the two breakaway republics as actually separate states, which he had really been reluctant to do for 8 years, So interestingly, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, for example, which is the successor to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, supports the special military operations. But again, not all leftists do. And again, I have a lot of leftist friends there that have varying degrees of feelings about the special military operations and about Putin. And again, some are very critical of Putin. So, that's, my 2 cents on that.
Rick, did you have anything to add?
No, that's fine.
Let me just add a couple of things. First of all, besides being to Russia a couple of times, I've been to Ukraine a couple of times, and it should be noted that just as in Russia, the second largest party in Ukraine before the 2014 coup was the Communist Party. First largest was the Party of Regions, both of which wanted better relationships with Russia, and both of which were banned right after the coup. But many, many people from Donbass and since the special military operations have left the country. We've seen a lot of that on US TV about them going to Poland and so forth. But what is not known is the majority of them went to Russia, not to Poland, not to Germany, not to the UK. In fact, the number of refugees that went to Russia is twice the number that did go to Poland. But you don't hear from those particular people. But they do have an organization in Russia. I meet with them often on Sundays. In fact, I'm missing the meeting right now with people from the Ukrainian Federation of Refugees and Political Prisoners that are in Russia now. They organize this meeting for progressives from United States and and Europe, and we talk about a number of these subjects. In fact, they just organized a conference in Moscow to discuss the situation this past weekend, I believe, or 2 weeks ago, maybe, to discuss the situation in Ukraine. When I went to the peace conference I mentioned right after 2014, it was organized by leaders of the Communist Party and other members of split-off groups from the Communist Party, or their Communist Workers' Party and others. They're all very much supportive of Russia's position. They understood that although they don't agree with Putin, they are the opposition party to Putin, second largest party in the Congress, the opposition party to Putin in the Russian parliament, but they did see this as an existential threat to Russia, what was going on in Ukraine and NATO's war, and they did support it. And as Dan said, they even were a little bit more aggressive. They were pushing Putin to be more aggressive in defense of what was going on there. Yeah. Now, there are some other leftists that I've heard of. A lot of them are from some of the European countries. Some of them were from some Trotskyist movements, although some of the Trotskyist movements have a position in support of Russia in this war against NATO. But there were some like that took a different position. So there are all sorts of leftists. But the main leftist groups in Russia and in Ukraine took the side of the Russians in this battle. The second time I was to Ukraine, I was there to go to witness the memorial service they held for the people that were massacred in Odessa after the coup. When they were protesting the coup, a group of Nazis came to ostensibly to go to a soccer match, came from around the country and killed about 50 of them and wounded about 100 of them. The next day, of course, the only people that were arrested, even though all of it's on cameras, the Nazis with their guns, the Nazis was throwing the Molotov cocktail. The only people that were arrested were the survivors of that massacre, including people I met with when I was there. However, when they were arrested, the next day, the people of Odessa, 30,000 of them showed up at the police station and physically took them out of the jails and stop that process that the government was doing against them. But when we were there, we witnessed thousands of people at this memorial walking past the House of Trade Unions where the massacre took place and leaving flowers. And we also witnessed the Nazis coming to try to intimidate them. And they were Nazis. It's not, in the US, it's not cool to say that there's Nazis there, but there are Nazis there. They're real Nazis. They're people with tattoos of swastikas on their coats, the people that give fascist salutes. They were there to intimidate. But we saw the relationship that there were thousands of people. Many of these people who were there for that memorial were Russian speaking and did not want to be part of this coup government and wanted to be part of some kind of Russian society. So they exist in large numbers in the left and in the population as a whole. It's just that we don't hear about it in the United States because of the propaganda that we hear. Okay, so we're at an hour and a quarter. Should we take a few more questions? Are you up for that, or?
Sure.
Okay. Here's a question which is a little bit different. I don't know that you can tell the answer about it. Someone asked about, do you know anything about Gonzalo Lira and how he is? If either of you would like to know that what happened with him, or I can say what happened with him to any extent. I mean, would you like me to do? Gonzalo Lira is a person who's been living in Ukraine. He's a U.S. citizen. He's also a citizen of Chile, the dual citizenship of two countries. And he was doing independent reporting. Of course, his wife is Ukrainian, and they live in Kharkiv. And he was doing independent reporting. Like anybody that does independent reporting in Ukraine, he was recently arrested. And he has been disappeared, so nobody knows what's happening with him. Many of his friends and people that follow his writings and follow his stuff have been very concerned, but we don't know. But since he's a U.S. citizen, he was questioned. The State Department was questioned at one of its recent press conferences, and they refused to say they would do anything about it. They just scuffed it off. So it's important that people write to their own legislatures. That's what's being asked by the people that support him, and ask that they demand of their client state, the Ukraine, to free Gonzalo Lira, as well as free the many other political prisoners that are there, but that's another story. How can we get information like what you're saying out in the United States, especially given the high level of propaganda, that you don't hear reports such as yours? If you have thoughts?
I can offer, on a daily basis, antiwar.com is producing excellent news. It's the best source that I'm aware of daily news, what's going on, and analysis. Of course, there are other sites as well, whether it's Covert Action Monthly or Mint Press News, or LA Progressive has some good stuff. There are various sites. I think there are a number of analysts on the web now who are doing terrific work. One is called the Duran. Another one is called, look up podcast with Colonel Douglas McGregor, very sharp analyst. Scott Ritter, of course, is terrific. And I don't know, who am I missing, Dan?
Jack Matlock has had some good stuff. Merchheimer's, is that his name?
Merchheimer.
It's very, very good. Yeah, someone mentioned Consortium News,
Mhm.
of course. Andre Martinoff has a podcast, which is good.
Mhm.
So those are the other one is Redacted. I think is very good. It's a fairly new show with this couple. One had worked for Fox, the other one for CNN, a man and a woman, and they're married now. And they have a show called Redacted, which is quite good, which you can find on YouTube. I urge people to watch. And of course, people should be writing letters to your editors of your newspapers too. I mean, can't guarantee those are going to get in there, but I think that's very worthwhile trying to do to get the word out. And protests, if we had a big peace movement, that was able to build some big protests, we'd get more publicity for our position. And I, Rick and I both, and Joe, obviously, we hope by, doing these sorts of webinars, we can encourage, the building of that type of peace movement again, which, we desperately need at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's unfortunate that politics kind of begins and ends with the U.S. electoral system, but that's our reality. And this is of course we can do as much as possible beyond that. But given the importance, I think it's essential to demand our representatives take a position and oppose more weapons to Ukraine. That's the bottom line. Do you support continuing the war or ending the war? And I think it was very good news that RFK Jr. has said if he doesn't get the nomination, no, he will not support any candidate who's promoting the war.
Okay. Let me just say again that if you're interested in the slides that Rick showed, and if I can get Dan's also, if you send a message to unacpeace@gmail.com, I will try to get them to you. There was questions about whether the chat, people could get the chat. I believe there is a way you can save your own chat, and that might be by hitting some of those 3 dots there. It might tell you if you can do that. But I will save it. And as I said, if you registered for this webinar, you'll get the video of it tomorrow at some point. I will put the chat in there also. I'll make a link to the chat. I'll put the chat in there if anybody would like to see what people had to say and see what people wrote. So why don't we just see if there's any final comment from Dan or Rick, and then we'll call it a day. And let me just also mention before we do that, that people mentioned Scott Ritter as one source. All these sources are good sources. I follow them too. I also follow on Telegram. If you get a Telegram link, it's not censored, and you can find both the Ukrainian Telegram channels, mostly from individuals, and the Russian Telegram channels, and you get both sides of the argument, which you don't hear in this country. It takes work to do this kind of stuff. And although the sources that were mentioned by the speakers are good sources, they're small sources relative to the major corporate media. So most people don't hear this message. So it is our job to do what we can to get it out. We get it out through actions, demonstrations, webinars, conferences, all these means. You have to become active in the anti-war movement, and you have to become active in various organizations like the Sanctions Kill organization and others that deal with these questions for your own edification, so you could learn things yourself. But these organizations will have a bigger reach, not a gigantic reach, but a bigger reach than what you can do by yourself. And together, as we build these organizations and we build a movement, we can come across with an alternative narrative. We're being shut down all over the place. People like Scott Ritter that was mentioned, and others, Gonzalo Lera, had his stuff taken off of YouTube because they said it's Russian propaganda. Anything you say up against the government now is on the question of Ukraine is Russian propaganda. I'm not a Russian propagandist. I am a socialist. If I was in Russia, I would be to the left of Putin. I would be arguing against Putin. But when there's a war against Russia, and I see the main imperialist power, the United States and its NATO allies, doing this, I would join. I would not have the space to argue against my government. I would be taking my time and my effort to argue against the imperialist threat against my country. Just like what happened in Syria and Libya, you could disagree with the leaderships of those countries, but what people did was they came together to fight the invasions and to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan and all over the world. That is the duty of progressive people when countries are under attack. So when the US does this to countries in Latin America and all over the world, it really does not allow, if you are in opposition to the present government, it does not allow you the space to really develop that opposition, because the pressing need at that particular time is to impose the imperialist powers that are sanctioning your country, blockading your country, attacking your country, causing coups against your country, threatening you with weapons. That's the task that's right in front of you. So where I was going with that, I'm not sure, but I hope that made some sense. So let's see if the other two have any last comments, and then we can leave it at that.
Well, yeah, I'll comment. Thanks for organizing this event, Joe, very much, and for the great leadership that UNAC has shown. Just a shout out on Code Pink has been doing some excellent work as well, the Peace in Ukraine Coalition. Marcy Winograd, on this coming Tuesday, there's going to be a special Code Pink Congress. They call it a calling party, and specifically focused on Ukraine and Crimea. So I would encourage people to think about that also. And Dan and I are going to try to get together more photos from our trip. And so we will pass that on to Joe so it can be distributed. Photos from St. Petersburg, a lot of photos, other photos from Crimea. So, and we invite people to contact us. The three articles we've written are published at antiwar.com, LA Progressive, Dissident Voice, and other sources. But it's been very good to be here. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Yeah, mostly I just want to thank everyone for joining us on a Saturday morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. And I just want to say maybe a hopeful note at the end. I mean, look, we live in interesting times, which I know could be a curse, but it's also a blessing. And we have the privilege of, working to save humanity by fighting, by preventing a nuclear war. I mean, what is a greater vocation in the world than to try to do that? And we should do that, and we can do that. And I just thank everyone for being part of that struggle. And, let's keep, working towards that goal. It's a simple one, but again, maybe it'll save the fate of humanity. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Good night, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon.
Yep.
Take care.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.